everyone, and welcome to our virtual lecture, Women in Trousers, from Bloomers to Le Smoking, with Dr. Victoria Pass. Today's lecture is brought to you by the Jersey City Office of Cultural Affairs, and we are so glad to see so many of you joining us from across the country and around the world. This is a beautiful opportunity for us to bring our programming from our corner of the US to all of you in your homes. And this is a great honor to be able to bring this programming to you. As part of our commitment to access, we are going to begin with self-description. I am a white woman with shoulder-length blonde hair. I'm wearing a gray blazer and a black shirt, and I have a gold chain on. My name is Christine Goodman, and I am the director of the Office of Cultural Affairs. We're presenting this program tonight, and our office works to develop consistent cultural programming and events that highlight Jersey City's arts community while honoring the rich diversity that we have here. We provide support and resources landmark and organization that is presenting the programming you see here tonight. So through our arm of telling the history of Jersey City and beyond, we're bringing this program to you. So thank you for joining us. And anything you'd like to find out about our cultural affairs programming, you can find at our website, which is jerseycityculture.org. So no matter where in the country you're tuning in or where from around the world, we invite you to come to jerseycityculture.org and to see what we're doing over here in Jersey City. There are virtual programs that are available to you now, and we will continue to add exciting lectures like tonight's lecture to the site. So now I would like to turn it over to Gretchen. Gretchen von Koenig is our program coordinator here for the Apple Tree House, and she will tell you a little bit more about this program.
Hi, everybody. Can you all hear me? I got kicked off for a moment, so I'm back in. I don't know if anybody caught that, but thank you for the introduction, Director Goodman. My name is Gretchen. I'm a white woman with medium brown hair, red earrings, a Philip Johnson local artist, gray silkscreen sweater, and glasses that sometimes are on my face and sometimes aren't. I am a program manager at the Apple Tree House and curator and grant writer for the historic home. And in late 2019, or in the middle of 2019, we were awarded a grant from the New Jersey Council of Humanities to bring to life programming that commemorated the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And a big part of that, we worked with the Social Studies Department of Jersey City Public Schools to bring women's history related curriculum to classrooms from grades 4 to 12, and had a history research project competition that was aiming to take place at the Apple Tree House. You can think of it a little bit like a science fair, but for the humanities, where students designed and presented research on museum quality boards, and we were going to have a bunch of pageantry and lectures at the house to really kind of solidify a lot of this programming. But as you are all well aware, COVID interrupted a lot of those plans, and we're now hosting the history fair online in a virtual exhibition, which is now live, and you can see some of the wonderful work our students did throughout our city on women's history related research projects. In conjunction with that, we had originally worked with Dr. Pass to bring this lecture to the students of Snyder High School that made some sash replicas of women protest sashes, votes for women. And in rethinking our programming and digital and virtual availability, this program now is being brought to a larger audience and will be recorded for classrooms to use in their history classes this year. So we're very excited to welcome our speaker, Dr. Victoria Pass. Victoria is a specialist in visual culture, particularly in areas of design and fashion. She's an assistant professor at the Maryland Institute College of Art, where she teaches courses in design history and visual culture. Her research considers the history of fashion culture in the 20th century and focuses specifically on issues of gender and race. She recently co-edited the book Design Beyond the Canon with Jennifer Kauffman-Buhler and Jennifer Kauffman-Buhler and Christopher Wilson, published by Bloomsbury in February 2019. And recently, the essay Racial Masquerades in Magazines, Defining White Femininity Between the Wars was published in the Journal of Modern Periodical Studies. Her writing has also appeared in Fashion, Style and Popular Culture, Omenka Magazine, Design and Culture, and caa.reviews. She received her BA in art history from Boston University, her MA in art history from the Art Institute of Chicago, and her PhD in visual and cultural studies from the University of Rochester. So take it away, and let me stop that share real quick and let's hand it over to Dr. Pass. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much, Gretchen. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much to Jersey City Cultural Affairs for hosting me. I'm sorry we didn't get to do this for the students as we had imagined it way back when, but I'm thrilled to be able to do this in this much more accessible way, actually, where we can all be cozy at home and talk fashion and talk trousers. I had to do it. It was unavoidable. So let me self-describe before I get carried away. I'm a white woman with shoulder-length curly brown hair, blue eyes, big old glasses, pink lipstick, a bright red shirt, and a colorful scarf. Okay, so with that, I'm going to make the awkward transition to sharing my screen and jump right in. Let me say, again, welcome to everybody, and thank you to Gretchen so much for asking me to give this talk and ushering me through the process. Also wanted to say to all of you watching, please, if questions come up or comments come up, put them in the chat. I've done a couple of these and it's really fun when you all kind of talk to each other in the chat. It makes it a lot more exciting. So please feel free to do that as we go. So as I was working on this talk, the Vogue cover featuring our Vice President, Kamala Harris, dropped. And it struck me as really interesting because in part there was such a strong reaction to it from the public. Some people were really excited to see our Vice President on the cover, but some people felt that the cover photograph wasn't quite up to snuff. It wasn't what this history-making Vice President deserved. And there's a lot of striking elements about the image, not least of which the fact that Harris is, of course, the first woman and the first Black woman, the first woman of South Asian descent to hold this office. But also, interestingly, she is the first political office holder of either gender to grace the cover of Vogue magazine. So lots of vice presidents, lots of first ladies have graced the cover, but the political actors have typically been inside the magazine from time to time rather than on the cover. So I think Vogue was in some ways struggling with how to represent a political power holder on its cover. There was no tradition of doing this. And I think what they ended up doing was kind of leaning into the model of the First Lady. And that's why Pat Nixon is here. Pat Nixon was the first lady to appear publicly and be photographed in trousers. So certainly first ladies before Nixon wore trousers, but she was the first to be publicly photographed in them here in Ladies' Home Journal in 1972. And what I think is really interesting is that the cover with Harris was trying to do that same like accessibility kind of thing, making her seem welcoming to the public. But I do wonder if a vice president actually needs to be accessible, or maybe this is the feminine version of wanting to go out for a beer with a male political candidate. But one thing that's really interesting is the thing that no one has seemed to really be talking about is that Kamala Harris is wearing pants. She's not wearing a skirt. And if we look at the model of the first ladies appearing on the cover, they tend to be wearing dresses or skirts. Hillary Clinton being an exception that proves the rule here on Mirabella, I think in trousers. And she is the only first lady, Clinton, to have been depicted in her official state portrait in trousers. Michelle Obama, I think, particularly because of the extra pressure of being the first African-American first lady, chose a dress for her official portrait by the great Amy Sherrill of my home state of Maryland. And also on magazine covers has tended, at least while in office as first lady, to favor dresses. While Clinton did wear pants, she certainly got a lot of blowback about her style. And even when she was a presidential contender, there was a lot of discussion about pants, although I think people were generally more positive about it at that point. But women have been wearing trousers in Europe and the US since at least the 19th century. And women in other places have certainly been wearing them for much longer. For instance, records show that women in Persia wore pants from at least the 4th century. But in Europe and the US, women wearing trousers has always been, and in some cases still remains controversial, I think. So I think about growing up, for instance, in my synagogue, you really couldn't wear pants to services. People would look at you funny. So there are still certain places in which it's not permissible for women to wear pants. In US politics, I think we get a kind of interesting peer in, and this seems to have been one of the sort of last places in which women had to really break through in order to wear trousers. There were no official rules, but there were these unwritten rules and peer pressure that created this kind of informal dress code. Representative Charlotte Thompson Reed, who was a Republican from Illinois, was the first in the House of Representatives to wear trousers. She wore a bell-bottom suit in 1969. And the ensemble, interestingly, was a Christmas present from her staff. It had also come with a skirt, but they urged her to wear the pants. And she said, after quite a lot of hubbub about her pantsuit invading the halls of Congress, as the headline reads, that she wouldn't wear them again, saying, quote, "I am really quite serious about my service in Congress, and I wouldn't want to do anything that seemed factious. Neither would I want to do anything to take away from the femininity of the women in the House, even though I think pants are feminine looking." The Senate, on the other hand, was much more conservative, and it wouldn't be until 1993 that women would challenge the unwritten rules about dress codes there. This was notably after the Year of the Woman, post the Anita Hill hearings, when for the first time, more than 2 women were serving in the Senate at once. 6 women would be there that year, including Barbara Mikulski from Maryland, who had already been there, and newly elected Carol Moseley Braun from Illinois, who was the first African-American woman elected to Senate. Now, in Illinois, Moseley Braun was used to wearing trousers on the floor as an Illinois representative. And she had no idea that she wasn't supposed to wear them in the Senate because it was an unwritten rule and she was new there. So on one winter morning, she walked on the floor in an Armani suit and was shocked that people were audibly gasping at what she was wearing. She didn't realize what the problem was until excited female staffers came up to her and said, "Finally, we have someone on our side," because they had been hoping to be able to wear trousers and did not like this restrictive dress code. Afterwards, Barbara Mikulski decided she would wear her trousers as well. And this was a snowy day and she thought it would be more comfortable. And she, knowing the unwritten rule, asked the president pro tempore of the Senate to check the official rules to see if there was anything against her wearing trousers, and the president pro tempore apparently just nodded rather than saying yes, maybe didn't want to be held responsible. And Mokulsky reported, "You would have thought I was walking on the moon." People were so shocked at this gesture. Others followed suit, including staffers who were very excited at the rule change. And this resulted in Martha Pope, who was then the sergeant at arms, and notably the first woman to hold that job, changing a written policy manual she had created for the doorkeepers to say women are required to wear business attire, i.e. dress, skirt, blouse, business suit, coordinated pantsuit, slacks, and matching blazer, no stirrup pants. So stirrup pants are beyond the pale on the Senate floor. I'm not sure if that rule has changed at all. But that really was sort of an interesting moment, because I think many people outside of US government hadn't realized that those rules were still there, since by the 1970s, trousers were pretty well accepted as workwear for women. And now all manners of dress constitute professional attire. So the question I want to talk about this evening is, why did it take so long for pants to become a regular part of women's wardrobes in Europe and the US at all times of day and in all contexts? And the simple answer is that women wearing pants were seen as a threat to the status quo. Pants allow women to take on jobs that had belonged to men and to participate in activities that had previously only been enjoyed by men. Clearly, pants still have this kind of resonance, right? We talk about who's wearing the pants as a symbol of power. I think it's helpful to sort of think about where pants started. So here is the oldest existing that we have uncovered pair of pants. And what's interesting about these is they are not cut like you would cut a traditional sewing pattern, but rather the shape is created on the loom. So through the process of weaving, each leg would be woven separately. And you can see these are beautifully preserved. They were found in an excavation of burial grounds called the Yanghai Graveyard in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in Western China. They are from the 13th to the 10th century BCE and were likely worn by horsemen. And you can see that the two legs are joined together in the crotch, which helps to reinforce that, which would have been really helpful if you're using these to ride horses. And the dry climate preserved the beautiful pattern work that you can see around the knee area there. So trousers are harder to make than just draping fabric to create a toga or something like that. So it's really horses that propel the idea of making a tailored garment like trousers. So for instance, in ancient Greece, you'll see representations of Amazon women warriors wearing them. The Greeks tended to depict barbarian groups they labeled as barbarians wearing them, which tells you what they thought of pants. They identified them with foreigners. And interestingly, they were very vexed that these were unisex garments worn by people like the Persians and the Scythians from Central Asia. And so they thought of them as feminine garments. In China, they were also unisex garments and were worn for horse riding in particular. They were also worn for the same purpose in India, and there's a sari style worn by Marathi women, where you can see a strip of fabric is drawn between the legs to create kind of a trousered effect, helpful for riding horses. But in the United States, it wouldn't really be until the mid 19th century, at least in any organized way. Certainly women would have been putting on men's trousers at different times in different places. But it's not until really the middle of the 19th century that trousers, especially made for women, become a major part of fashion. And this is, of course, the bloomer, which ties us into the anniversary that we celebrated of women's suffrage. And of course, always important to note that what we're celebrating in 1920 is suffrage for white women. But these were garments that were being introduced in the context of a movement for women's suffrage by feminists who were advocating for lots of different kinds of dress reforms for women. Amelia Bloomer gives her name to the bloomers, but she's not actually the first person to wear them. A woman named Elizabeth Smith Miller was. Bloomer was a feminist and suffrage activist, and also importantly, a journalist with her own newspaper called The Lily. And she started publishing about these Turkish trousers, that's hard to say, as she called them. And you can see the photograph on the left of an Algerian woman wearing similar trousers. This is where the idea came from, trousers that were worn by women in Turkey, in Algeria, in those areas. And interestingly, when Bloomer reported on these trousers, she said that Elizabeth Smith Miller had the approval of her husband and her father when she wore them. And she wore them to visit her cousin, who happened to be Elizabeth Cady Stanton, significant suffrage activist, as well as to Washington, D.C., where her father was serving in Congress, and they were widely reported on. Amelia Bloomer wore the costume for about 6 to 8 years, and she had adopted the style like Miller because it was lighter and more comfortable than the crinolines that were typical of the 1850s. So it made it more practical, particularly for traveling, with which both Miller and Bloomer were doing. And there were other women who adopted the style as well, such as Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, who you see on the left, and we'll visit her again, as well as Elizabeth Cady Stanton. In addition to their comfort, the notoriety of this unusual garment created a certain Bloomer's eyes was really exciting. She was wearing consternation among critics, but also there were a lot of women who were very excited and who were writing her letters, asking for patterns, and it was quickly taken up by many other feminists. But what quickly happened is that this garment was lampooned in the media. And you can see in this sampling of cartoons the anxieties that were unleashed, the fear that women were going to be taking on masculine privileges, that women would start proposing, that they would start smoking cigars, that they would start drinking, they would ignore their domestic responsibilities, and horror of horror, men might have to start taking care of children. So all of this kind of poking fun that was happening at Bloomers, and this sense of hysteria around them was starting to overshadow the feminist movement, which was what Amelia Bloomer and other feminists and women's suffrage activists really cared about. And so they decided it really wasn't worth wearing the garment anymore. And so they stopped. So it's really just 6 or 8 years when you have feminists and suffrage activists wearing this garment. And I think we can have a kind of corollary example if we think about the pink pussy hats that many women donned, and men, people of all genders, donned for the Women's March in 2017. And one of the things that quickly happened as the Women's March developed in this very kind of organic way is that a lot of the rhetoric that was being used was very much rhetoric that was rooted in white feminism and in a kind of cis hetero feminism, and excluded many people, including trans folks. And so the pink pussy hat started to sort of signify this white feminism that was exclusive rather than inclusive, and quickly fell out of favor with protesters. So I think there's something similar where this hat just like took on this extra meaning that was no longer useful to the protesters. The other reason, by the way, that Bloomers may have fallen out of favor is also because cage crinolines began to offer a lighter alternative to many layers of petticoats and fabric crinolines. And the Industrial Revolution made such a technology possible. An important note in thinking about the way that fashion was deployed by suffrage activists is that it's really, generally speaking, white suffrage activists who are using the bloomer as a signifier of their politics. Sojourner Truth, for instance, was not interested at all, as she says in this quotation, in wearing bloomers, because she had to wear trousers when she was enslaved and was forced to wear these kinds of garments, forced to wear all of her garments. She wore whatever she was given by her enslavers, but pants were part of what she had to wear when she was enslaved. And so she refused to engage in this and felt that they had nothing to do with signifying the politics that she was interested in. What's interesting, though, is that Harriet Tubman, who, like Sojourner Truth, used fashion to construct an image of herself as fashionable and respectable in photographs, did want a bloomer's dress, but she wanted it for a very particular reason. And I'll read this quotation from a letter she wrote to Franklin Sanborn, I think around 1863. She writes, "I want a bloomer dress made of some coarse, strong material to wear on expeditions. In our late expedition up the Combahee River, in coming on board the boat, I was carrying 2 pigs for a poor sick woman who had a child to carry. And the order double quick was given, and I started to run, stepped on my dress, it being rather long, and fell and tore it almost off, so that when I got on board the boat, there was hardly anything left but shreds. I made up my mind then that I would never wear a long dress on another expedition of the kind, but would have a bloomer as soon as I could get it." And so you can see here that the appeal for Tubman is the utilitarian qualities of the bloomers that would have allowed her to continue to work to free enslaved people. In this case, this was part of a military mission. She was the first woman to lead a military operation in the United States under the command of Colonel James Montgomery during the Civil War. In this case, working with 150 African-American Union soldiers to rescue more than 700 slaves during the raid. So you can imagine a pair of bloomers might have done her more service than that long skirt she talks about. So there are sort of different reactions to the idea of using this kind of garment to express political values. And there are also different kinds of practical considerations and legal considerations to go along with it. As the bloomer costume became popular in the middle of the 19th century, so too did laws against, quote, wearing the dress of the opposite sex, end quote. The first one in Columbus, Ohio in 1848. Couldn't find one in Jersey City, but I did find one in 1858 in Newark, New Jersey. And here you can see a list of many more just to give you a sense. I think this probably is not coincidental. This is happening just as suffrage activism is really heating up. And also, as you have the growth of American cities, and this is something that Susan Stryker documents, in which you have the growth of gay and later in the post-World War I lesbian communities in those cities for whom cross-dressing often was a way of signaling one's queer identity. I told you I'd bring Mary Walker Edwards back. She was a doctor in the Civil War and actually earned the Congressional Medal of Honor in 1865 for her service. She was also frequently arrested for impersonating a man, even though she argued that Congress had awarded her special permission to dress in this way because of her occupation. But that certainly didn't stop her, and she kept dressing this way. And other women too adopted trousers in different ways for their jobs and their careers. Mountaineer Annie Smith Peck or Miss Martha Jane Canary there in her buckskins, as well as women who performed hard labor in coal pits, known as the pit brow lasses here in Wigan and Lancashire in the UK. And what's interesting about the image of these women is that these photographs were made into postcards of the pit brow lasses, and they were a popular collectible of people among higher classes than these working women. And there was this kind of excitement about these racy women in trousers and this kind of voyeurism into this this other class and the work that they were doing. So it's a sort of interesting example. It's not really until the advent of the safety bicycle in 1880 when bloomers really come back in a strong way for women of many different classes. And the safety bicycle, which is the bike that has 2 wheels of the same size, not the penny farthing with like the giant wheel and the little wheel, which is easier to ride, as well as pneumatic tires, which made it much more comfortable to ride, that made bicycles really popular among people of all genders. And bloomers were a really good option for women, as well as shorter skirts too. One in every 12 New Yorkers, there was one bike for every 12 New Yorkers in the mid 1890s. And here you can see some examples of what women wore on those bikes. Everything from skirts with a split in the back to sort of hide the fact that they were trousers. If you look carefully at the women on the Alameda Avenue Bridge on the top right, you'll notice they're not wearing skirts, but actually wearing divided skirts there. And you can see very different from what their male companions are wearing, which I would call plus fours. And you can see Kitty Knox on the bottom from Boston, who was a bicycle racer and the first African-American to be accepted into the League of American Wheelmen, which would quickly change their rules to exclude people of color. But Knox managed to stay in the organization and continue to race. She was a seamstress and a dressmaker and fashioned these amazing ensembles for herself to wear that were much more along the lines of the masculine kind of plus fours there. So we have, on the one hand, sportswear, an occupation that is pushing women into adopting trousers, divided skirts, and things like that. And you can see on this example on the left, the look of the skirt is really emphasized to sort of hide the trouser. But one other thing that happens that we see beginning in this period, starting around 1911, is the use of Orientalism, this rhetoric of Orientalism, as a way of mitigating the wearing of trousers by women. So here's sort of two ways that a masculine garment is feminine. In the case of sportswear, pants are made to look like a skirt. And in the case of work by designers like Paul Poiret, pants are being related to this imaginary fantasy place of the Orient. And this idea of Orientalism, which Edward Said writes about in his book in 1978 called Orientalism, he talks about it as being an imaginary geography, this way in which the West defines itself as against the East or the Orient. And this construction is used to support colonialist and imperialist ambitions. If you want to use your blood and your money to colonize, you have to give some kind of moral reason to the public. And so Orientalism was used to construct people who, in this case, the French and British governments, but this was not exclusively a French and British thing, were trying to colonize. You had to portray them as needing colonialism, needing to be ruled by a wise government, needing to be reformed. And so the images emphasize decadence, they emphasize things like polygamy and harems. They never show people working. And so they sort of suggest that these places need, in the Middle East, need rule, need European rule through colonization. And these constructions also, as you can see from these 19th century paintings, always emphasize sexuality and are frequently populated with female bodies. And so this image of the harem that's part of this Orientalist construction becomes a particularly popular one in visual culture. So in France, for instance, the Ballet Russe, which is started by Serge Diaghilev in 1909, performs a number of ballets that use these kind of Orientalist themes, such as Scheherazade in 1910. And here you can see female dancers wearing harem trousers. These are designed by the costume designer Leon Bakst. And so this is part of what sparks Poiret's brain, thinking about how he might incorporate these kinds of Orientalist themes into his collections. And famously, in 1911, he stages what he calls the 1002nd Night Party with a Persian theme, and he decorates his whole garden like Aladdin's palace with silk cushions and fountains. And he tells all the guests they must dress in Persian style clothes. And oh, don't worry if you don't have them, because I'll supply my latest collection for you to wear. So this helps to promote his trousered styles, which he called jupe culotte. And so by binding up these trousers with this idea of Orientalism, he's able to sort of mitigate the idea that these women are taking something from white men, because in this case, what they're taking is not from white men, it's coming from the East, it's coming from the Orient. So it's those othered men whose privilege is being taken from them. And the scholar Minha Tifam has written about this in an essay called Paul Poiret's Magical Techno-Orientalist Fashions. And she argues here that clothing is a kind of technology that Poiret used to create a virtual experience of the other, and that Poiret's garments in their Orientalism are a way of underwriting French imperialism and defining French national identity. So Orientalism is a kind of way of having it both ways. Women are liberated and get to wear trousers, but it's at the expense of this racist imaging of the Oriental man, as opposed to an emasculated white man. So there's this element of race that runs through it. And it's part of instating white supremacy in that sense. Pham has argued that the privilege of pants is mitigated through this fantasy. And here you could see some of Poiret's designs, not meant for fancy dress, but meant for everyday wear in the garden and on the tennis court and so forth. What I think is really interesting here is that this attachment of Orientalism to trousered styles for women is very long-lived. Here's a Jean Lanvin example from the 1930s that was in the really wonderful exhibition Gender Bending Fashion at the MFA in Boston a few years ago. And here we can see some examples from Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. So in all of these cases, these sort of accessories or language, such as in Harper's Bazaar there on Dolores Del Rio, the caption says Chinese clothes for the sun. These garments are being described as coming from somewhere outside of the West. And so it's not white men's trousers that are being taken, it's Chinese men's trousers that are being taken, for example. So as a way of mitigating that threat that is posed by women wearing pants. And this doesn't stop. We can find harem trousers all across the years. And even in 1911, there were many designers beyond Poiret who were showing these styles, lest you think it's just him standing for them. Lots of different designers were, including for roller skating. But again, we have a kind of event, historical event that is bigger, that really propels many more women into wearing trousers. And in this case, it's World War I that will see women of all classes donning trousers and coveralls, performing vital war work. Munitions workers, for instance, who had to wear very particular uniforms because anything metal could accidentally spark an explosion. This was incredibly dangerous work that these women were doing. And you can see the posters urging these women to do it don't include what they're really wearing. It shows this munitionette in a dress, but here you can see the kinds of garments these women are wearing. And one thing I think is worth noting is the bagginess of the trousers. I think there was this anxiety about showing off too much of the shape of a woman's body with a more closely tailored trouser. And then on the bottom left, you can also see these sort of aprons or skirts that are used to cover up. So there is a sense of modesty that's kind of built into how these garments are tailored. Another group of women who wore trousers in World War I were the Women's Land Army of America and the British Women's Land Army. The American organization was a civilian group, unlike the British. They had no government support at all. But basing themselves on the British model between 1917 and 1919, they managed to employ more than 20,000 women in 42 states. And they tapped into suffrage networks, including working under the leadership of Harriet Stanton Blatch, who was the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And they were working with college women and teachers, women who had seasonal schedules who could work on farms in the summer. So the name farmerette became a nickname for them, which at the beginning was kind of a dig at their suffragette origins, but eventually became a kind of loving nickname. And you can see some of the garments they're wearing are very similar to the bloomers costume. And some of them are clearly just something they got out from a brother's closet or a father's closet, whatever they could use and wear. And so you can see that towards the end of the war years, we have from the very high end in Vogue of gardening costumes with trousers to the Montgomery Ward catalog. These kinds of ensembles are offered for women doing all kinds of labor. And in fact, in 1917, Vogue asked the question, after trousers, what? This kind of anxiety of like, what will women do now that they've worn trousers? Well, it turns out they'll keep wearing trousers. So women will retain this garment, but it will be in different guises. It will be on the ski slope. It will be beach pajamas and lounging pajamas. they are still seen as masculine. So there's a sense of sort of appropriateness of different places. So for instance, when Lily de Alvarez, the tennis champion, wore a Schiaparelli divided skirt at Wimbledon in 1931, there was a huge scandal. And the Daily Sketch described this as more evidence that women had, quote, a masculine fixation. Whether we like it or not, girls will be boys, end quote. And the cover of Life magazine, this was not the Life that you may know from the 1950s, but a satirical magazine, I think also shows that anxiety about androgyny that begins to emerge in the 20s. Vogue magazine did its best to inform women when it was appropriate to wear trousers. And Hollywood women helped to popularize the garment in all different ways, whether it was adaptations of men's clothes like Marlene Dietrich's iconic tuxedo and Katharine Hepburn's dungarees, or chic beach trousers as you see Greta Garbo wearing. But women in Hollywood generally had a lot more leeway in terms of what they wore, although certainly the wearing of trousers by women like Garbo, Dietrich, and Hepburn marked them as kind of eccentric, was how they were usually described in magazines. And they were often sort of talked about as being masculine, which also helped them to become lesbian icons in lots of ways. I'm also including Anna May Wong here. There were many more celebrities, but I wanted to just give you a little suite of them. But what happens when ordinary women are adopting the style in the 1930s? Well, it turns out they run into a little bit of trouble, as Helen Hulick did. She was a witness to a burglary. I read different accounts. One said that her purse was stolen. One said that her house was broken into, so maybe her purse was stolen out of her house. But in any case, she was supposed to testify against the people accused of this burglary. She showed up to court wearing her slacks, and the judge sent her home saying that she was in contempt of court for wearing this ensemble. She explained that she really just wore slacks. That was what she wore. She was a kindergarten teacher, and her only dresses were formal. She also interestingly said that she was boycotting silk stockings since Japan had invaded China. And so there are a couple of different stories that she gave. But generally, she was defiant of the judge's order. When she came back the next day, she persisted in wearing trousers, and in fact, did so 3 times and was thrown in jail, supposedly for a 5-day sentence. She was only there for an hour. And the appellate division ended up finding in her favor, and women were then allowed to wear trousers. But I think it goes to show the way that this judge in particular was threatened by what she had chosen to wear. And I think particularly the style that she chose to wear, that she was wearing a tight sweater, that she was wearing these slacks, and he just felt this was not appropriate. But again, war comes, World War II in this case, and more women begin wearing trousers for war work, whether it was as nurses, and this is a family friend of mine, Phyllis Newman, in her uniform as an Army nurse in Okinawa. I think that she's probably wearing a flight nurse's uniform, which, as I could find, was the only one that included trousers. And I think this was the first time that a US Army uniform included trousers, but I'm not totally sure about that. I just have to do a little bit more research. But for women in uniform, as well as women working in shipyards, building planes, all of these places were places in which you needed trousers to do this essential war work. And there was still a kind of pushback about it. So you end up with ads like this one from Chatelaine, a Canadian magazine, saying, "Please don't stare at my pants," and explaining that these are essential to work for the war effort. There were also campaigns to make these kinds of uniforms more appealing to women. So for instance, Boeing hired the fashion designer Muriel King to redesign their uniforms. And King, interestingly, when she was tasked with this project, said, what the safety engineers failed to realize was that in order to make women eager to wear the new work clothes, they would first have to make the clothes attractive. So she set about doing just that, as well as designing features that would make them safe. So there were no cuffs or flat pockets. They had full cuts to give an ease of movement to the person wearing them. But also, as the Life magazine article that this image is from, they had snug, slimming waistlines, flattering, high-cut bosom lines, and sleek, tapered trousers. So there's this effort to make them feminine, right? I also like the detail that turbans, colorful turbans worn by the women, could act as kind of warning antennas as they're moving across the factory floor so that people can see them. Life magazine, again, in 1942, sharing this anxiety about slack, crazy women, and reported, women are breaking out in a rash of pants. And they noted also that the War Production Board listed in their rationing rules slacks, meaning that they were likely here to stay. And this story shows both women around town, but also doing essential war work, taking first aid classes, and so forth, wearing trousers. And again, magazines were at the ready to show women that trousers are so practical and chic, high-end examples. But once again, marginalized women still tended to be policed for wearing trousers, particularly if they wore trousers in ways that police didn't think were appropriate, or judges. So lesbian women, for instance, had been using trousers for a long time to project their identity. And someone like Gladys Bentley, the blues singer, is a good example of this. The cover of War and many more women wearing trousers meant that that was a little bit easier, but not for everyone, as these stories in the Chicago Defender show you, in which women are arrested or fined for wearing trousers. In one case, the girl said, "We're just wearing what white women wear. Why are we being fined?" And in fact, they were wearing what white women wore, but because they were Black, they were being targeted by the police. And I think also, in the case of at least one of the women here, it seems that because she read as male, that she was being targeted, perhaps because she was perceived to be a lesbian. Another interesting story along these lines in Chicago is that of Evelyn Jackie Bross, who you see on the left there. She was a war worker. She was the eldest of 13 at 19 years old in a Cherokee family that had moved to Chicago from Utah in order to take advantage of the new war jobs. And both she and her father worked in a defense plant. She was a machinist. And she was on her way home from work one night, dressed according to the Chicago Tribune in blue flannel trousers, a plaid sport shirt, a plaid Mackinac jacket, and Oxfords. Topping it off, she had a mannish haircut. And as early as 1851, Chicago had an ordinance outlawing cross-dressing. And so a cop picked her up, deciding that she looked too mannish in this clothing, and she was brought before the court. But in this time, the case really hit a nerve with the public because women were being asked to wear trousers for war work. And that was precisely what Bross was doing. She was working as a machinist doing essential work. So the city's leading women's club got involved. Harry Gilbert, the head of the regional federal office for war industry employment, got involved and said, if the girl cut her hair short, she should be awarded a medal instead of a court summons. Safety directors and factories everywhere have tried to encourage women to cut their hair short. Bross, for her part, said that she wore women's clothing because it was more comfortable than women's clothes and handy for work. And she went on to declare, "I wish I was a boy. I never did anything wrong. I just like to wear men's clothes, but everyone knows I'm a woman." In the end, all the public pressure allowed her to get off. But I think it shows us the ways that women who feminized the look of trousers were rewarded, but women who adopted a more masculine kind of androgynous presentation were not. And you can see two young women on the right-hand side who are likely lesbians who are wearing zoot suits, which is another garment that became popular among some women in this period, particularly Mexican-American women who were part of the zoot suit scene, this subculture, listening to jazz music, dancing, the swing, and wearing these really elaborate, very large, oversized suits. And the significance of the largeness of these suits is important because, for one thing, rationing meant that many of these were illegal because they were using more fabric than they were supposed to, but also because they were being worn typically by African American, Mexican American, and also Filipino American communities, men and women, more men than women, more than likely. But these young people were taking up visual space in a world that was marginalizing them, that wanted to really erase them. And so there was something of a resistance, both to rationing laws as well as to disappearing in the context of this racist culture. And this was really significant in a moment when America was claiming to be fighting for freedom, but also had all kinds of racist laws in effect. And many of these young people were actually working in defense work, but were facing significant racism, even as they would be supporting the war effort through their work. Cab Calloway and other African-American jazz performers and musicians helped to popularize this style. And it really originates, probably, it's not totally clear, but it probably originates in African-American communities among jazz enthusiasts. Malcolm X describes wearing a zoot suit to go dancing at the Roseland Ballroom. You can check out Ruth Carter's wonderful costumes for the film Malcolm X, where you can see both Denzel Washington as well as Spike Lee dancing in those costumes. But here you can see a couple of men at the bottom for some context, but you can see here how women adapted the style, in this case, women in Los Angeles. And some of these women actually called their garments defense drapes or defense capes, nodding to the defense work that they were doing. And you can imagine, like, the women at the YWCA outing could have worn these clothes to go and do their jobs, as well as wearing them for swing dancing and things like that. So you can see the wide lapels, bold makeup that many of these women are wearing, the high pompadour hairstyle, saddle shoes or huarache sandals, and padded shoulders. And lots of nods to the male style, including the signature tapered trousers. And those were also being picked up upon within Jewish American and other ethnic enclaves. And I think that's what we see here at Abraham Lincoln High School in Brighton Beach. And the story of this photograph is a good one. Beverly Bernstein, who was 16, wore a pair of blue gabardine slacks and a lipstick red sweater to school and was sent to the office of Dean of Girls and promptly sent home to change, which she did. But the students at the school were outraged and drew up a petition collecting 500 signatures within just a few hours. And in their petition, they cited the following reasons for wearing pants. A, the United States government advocates slacks for school because they are better than skirts in the event of an air raid. B, they conserve silk stockings. C, they curb sexy clothes such as short skirts. Note, boys also with the girls to wear slacks and are signing this petition and hope that it will be allowed. And the principal begrudgingly allowed the slacks, but I think probably what was being responded to, in addition to the fact that women were wearing trousers, is that they were wearing these pegged styles. They were emulating the zoot suit styles, and that sort of linkage with that subculture, I think probably worried the school principal. And so it's interesting that they were able to use the war effort to support these styles. Young women in colleges, too, were beginning to push the envelope in the 40s and into the 1950s. And there are a number of scholars, including Tanisha Ford and Deirdre Clemente, who have written about how women on college campuses, and Ford writes particularly about historically Black campuses, where women pushed for reform in dress codes and looser dress codes, and that was a kind of first step in organizing that those women would then take into the civil rights movement and the feminist movement with them. So I think it's a really interesting moment historically. And you can see these women really embracing casual style. Deirdre Clemente argues that that really helps to lead to just a general casualization of our wardrobes. And in the 1950s, you can see more and more women wearing trousers for casual circumstances. And eventually it starts to be reflected on television. So women like Lucille Ball, for instance, although she often wears the sort of hostess skirt, which is another way of, I think, mitigating the trousers. But my favorite, Mary Tyler Moore as Laura Petrie in the Dick Van Dyke Show, insisted legendarily on wearing pants in the show. And the sponsors said they would permit one scene in each episode so long as the trousers did not cup under her rear end. But the show pushed this and went a lot further, and the public responded. And really, Moore argued that what she was doing was just reflecting the way that real women were dressing in the 1960s. Another place that we see pants, and this is something that Tanisha Ford writes about in her wonderful book, Liberated Threads, is in protest marches in the civil rights movement. And what Ford documents in her book is a shift from an older generation of activists who, like Sojourner Truth, used middle-class clothing to create a respectable image for themselves, to create a polished image, as you see with these women on the top right, who are essentially wearing their Sunday best, the clothes they might wear to church, to these protest marches to defeat the kinds of stereotypes that were present in the US in this period. And that younger women who were entering the movement, particularly members of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, were starting to feel that this idea of dressing respectably wasn't really the best way to go about things. And I wanted to read a quotation from Ford because I think it gives you a really good sense of this. And you'll see in the photographs I have here what she's talking about. She writes, SNCC members were finding that maintaining a respectable body was difficult and that being respectably clad did not protect them. Remembering those early days of SNCC, Atlanta Field Secretary Debbie Amos Bell from Philadelphia remarked, "You see a lot of pictures, particularly of young women with skirts and petticoats and bobby socks, which is totally unreasonable if you're going to a demonstration," end quote. In the late 1960s, SNCC leaders began rethinking the political efficacy of the Black respectable body and the middle-class ideologies that undergirded it. They understood that emphasis on the dignity and home training of the Black middle class offered no shield from violence and created more distance between middle and working class African Americans. And so Ford talks about how these women negotiated those boundaries, choosing sometimes to wear skirts and more quote unquote respectable attire, and at other times wearing what you see Dory and Joyce Ladner wearing, which are overalls, which are really great for a protest because they're comfortable. They offer some protection for your body if violence occurs. And there's lots of pockets where you can stow anything you need for the day, including things that you might need if you end up getting arrested, which of course many of these women would. And finally, that takes us back to the late 60s and the early 70s. And one of the last bastions of wearing trousers, and this story of Yves Saint Laurent's The Smoking. So from everyday people in a protest march, in this case, to the upper echelons of couture, the French designer Saint Laurent offered this adaptation of a tuxedo, which wasn't actually a new thing. There were lots of other designers who had done it all the way back to the 1920s. But he offered a pretty splashy version in autumn winter of 1966 with trousers, which wasn't always the case, and this kind of androgynous look, which was famously captured in Helmut Newton's photograph from 1975 on the right. And part of the iconic status of this garment comes from a story of the socialite Nan Kempner, who attempted to wear the suit to a New York restaurant called La Côte Basque in 1968 and was promptly turned away by the maitre d' for not being properly attired. So she promptly took off the trousers, walked back in what she had fashioned as a mini dress, and that was fine. And she was seated, no problem. So it gives you a sense of the kind of strangeness of the 1970s. And So pants continue, I think, to be policed, and in some ways historically have been policed the same way leggings are today. So the idea like older women shouldn't wear pants, or you can't wear them if you have hips or a big rear end. And we see, I think, in this story how women's bodies, particularly the bodies of marginalized women, and people who are non-gender conforming, are frequently policed. And pants become sort of a vehicle for doing this. Over and over, pants are read as a signifier for feminism, especially by its detractors. But they also signified freedom to women who wore them, mobility, comfort, and entree into these male spaces and fields. And they had a really significant symbolic and political resonance, whether that was about lesbian identity, the political meaning of feminism for these individuals, their resonance and use in the civil rights movement and creating class alliances with working class people, or the idea of taking on male privilege, at least visually. And as I said, I think even today there are some places where we're still not supposed to wear pants as women. So it continues to be a somewhat controversial subject. All right, so let me stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Vicki. That was an incredible, engaging, visually stunning lecture. We have a couple of questions. So while we're talking about some of the questions we've already had dropped in the chat, go ahead and feel free to drop them as they come to you as well. And also thank you for all the people that have commiserated over their woes with pants. So those I really have been enjoying reading those as well. So one of the first questions that actually came up early in the lecture was from Yulia, who said, I keep hearing the word trousers, pants versus trousers. Is this in something to do with British English or American English, or is this a deliberate choice of words?
Yeah, I end up falling into pants, but I try to use trousers because in Britain, pants means underwear. So if you're in Britain and you're speaking to people who have learned British English, when you say I'm gonna wear pants to that, they're like, you're only gonna wear your underwear. So I try to use trousers, but I usually fall into the American English. So I think generally, to my mind, that's the distinction there. I think that the term slacks, which I think emerges like maybe around the 1930s, but maybe it's earlier than that. I haven't done enough close looking. That one seems to really refer to a kind of tapered trouser that's tailored to the body. But I'm not totally, I'm still sort of sussing out the kind of terminology. And of course it changes over time, I think, what it means.
Great, thank you so much. I did not know that about underwear meetings in the UK.
You gotta be careful.
So another question from Theo is, can you say a bit more about issues of identity and sexuality, and specifically heteronormative patriarchy surrounding women X? I've actually never had to pronounce that word. I've only seen it in writing, but women with the X over the last vowel.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that came from Theo.
Yeah, I think historically we have lots of discussions of lesbian communities and queer communities adopting cross-dressing. And so for women, using the kind of rhetoric of like butch femme historically. And I think one thing that's really interesting is that World War II made that a little bit more safe for certain kinds of women. And I think those women would have largely been white women, and women who could maybe either pass enough as men that they wouldn't be noticed, or women who somehow maybe feminize the look. And I think what's really interesting is I think the legal codes, and it's not just the legal codes, but it's the way that they're enforced, that tend to privilege certain kinds of heteronormative bodies, and this ideal of female bodies. So you have magazines telling women oh, put you know, wear a bow or something like that, like describing to them how they should dress. And actually there's a really interesting description when Jackie Bross is picked up, that there's a day that Bross is in court, and there's a woman who's in court who's picked up for solicitation, and she claims she was meeting her husband, I think, who was coming home from the war, but she is also wearing pants, but she's wearing what's described as a pantsuit, and she has a ribbon around her hair, and she has long blonde hair. So it's clear that they think that Bross is trying to pass as a man but isn't, and that that woman clearly is marking herself as female. So I think you can see how the enforcement of these laws by the police, but also by the courts, reinforces these ideas of what it means to be male and what it means to be female. And I didn't mention it before, and I meant to. Those are the same laws that are used to police LGBT communities, those laws about dressing, through the Stonewall riots. I mean, that's how they were arresting people at the Stonewall Inn. They were saying, oh, you're wearing, you know, we think you're a man and you're wearing, you know, more than, like, there was like magic number, like 3 garments or something that were male or female, excuse me. And that could land you in jail. So that's how those laws were being used to police those communities very specifically. And so I think what's really interesting to see is how people like, you know, Dietrich and Garbo and Hepburn, because I think because of their class status and because of their status as celebrities, are able to get away with more in terms of wearing men's clothing, and often wearing pretty androgynous clothing in lots of cases. But for an average woman, and particularly for a woman of color, you know, they can't really go that far and not be, if not picked up by the police, certainly harassed on the street.
Great, thank you so much. Actually, piggybacking on that, I kind of had a question about where you might see some of this critical mass. It was interesting listening to your lecture move and oscillate between these issues of, you know, just wanting to wear pants, and then this utilitarian logic, like, no, women need to wear pants to help the war. And like, when, under what guise did kind of the rhetoric of women can wear what they want prevail against other systems of why this is okay? When do you think that that happened? Because it was also interesting seeing those things in the chat come in about their experiences of jobs not even 40 years ago, about it still not being acceptable. And
Yeah.
as a millennial, I do feel like wearing pants whenever I want is totally fine. So when do you think that maybe happened? Or yeah.
I think that's a really good question. And what I think is really interesting, and I'm also noticing that in the chat too, from people of like, you know, like, oh, I went to this thing and I was the only person wearing pants, or like at my school, it wasn't allowed in the 70s, like things like that. And I think what's really interesting is that so many of these rules are not written rules, right? It's not like a formal dress code. I remember talking to somebody who said at her job in the, like in the 90s, her boss was just like, you can't wear pants, you know, like just like peer pressure or a boss telling you or something like that. And so I think that there are still these ways in which it's policed. And I'm sure some of that informal policing also happens around people's gender presentation too, right? So I'm sure like there's some of that that's also informing, you know, who is allowed to wear trousers and who isn't. And also like we could think about body type, all kinds of things that might feed into that. So I think now there's probably like, I don't know, maybe since the 80s, there's been more of a sense that you can wear what you want, but I don't think it's that fixed in a sense. I don't, you know, I've, aside from synagogue, I can't think of a place that I've existed in where I couldn't wear trousers, but I'm sure that that's not true for everyone, you know? And like leggings, I think are a good example too, right? Like, you know, oh, like you can wear leggings, but only if you're really thin, right? Like you can wear leggings, but only if you're really young, you know?
Yeah, I really appreciated that kind of contemporary look into like, here's how this might have you know, here's where we see the same rhetoric applied to a different type of clothing now, or similar kind of policing around who can and cannot and under what rules. So does anybody else have any other questions that they want to drop in the chat for Dr. Pass regarding pants?
I'm looking at the chat to see if there are others.
Yeah, it is it's trying to divert your attention to chat and the presentation. It's so hard because it was all so interesting.
But I love hearing people's stories about, you know, where they felt, you know, policed about what they were wearing, which I think many of us have probably felt, whether it was about pants or not. Oh, someone asked about band uniforms. Cindy asked about band uniforms for women. That's a really great question. And I hadn't really thought about looking at that, but I think that would be a great place to look. I think one of the things that's really exciting about fashion research, especially like thinking about a question like this, like, you know, my starting question was like, when were women allowed to wear pants? Kind of, is that you get to kind of look at the, like, really just everyday people, the people who aren't necessarily in Vogue or who aren't necessarily on screen or celebrities. But yeah, like when did band uniforms change? That's why I was so interested in the Army uniforms. And I was surprised I couldn't find a more definitive answer on that. I thought, like, I'll just Google this and Google will tell me, like, somebody surely has written up when women in the military started to be able to wear trousers, but I couldn't find it. So I'm going to go after that one, and I'll definitely start looking into the band uniform ones, because that's a great question. Yeah, Shane remembers wearing a dress for a choral competition in college. Yeah, that's so interesting. So yeah.
I do remember my mom always saying things that, or not my mom, my grandmother saying things that's, you know, if you want the job, you got to dress nice, wear a skirt, wear a collared, like, and so there is still this kind of thing with nice and skirt or dress as the nicer thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have another from Christine Woods. Can you also appreciate your analysis of the way Orientalist constructions may have carved out some allowance for pants wearing? Can you also reflect on how that particular style of pants also eroticized Western women by association with bothered women?
Oh, other women, Christine? Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, I think you're getting at exactly what I think that style is doing. So if you think about the Orientalist construction of the harem is a way of othering people in this imagined place, the Orient, right? So we in the West are monogamous, we marry one person, but they over there in the Orient are polygamous. They marry many women and they hold them in this harem, and that's terrible. So we have to go colonize them and fix that. But also, isn't it kind of fun if you're a white man to look at that harem and imagine what goes on there, right? So a white woman wearing those pants is able to sort of take on that sexuality. And what I think within fashion is really prevalent within the ways that a kind of, I wouldn't quite call that cultural appropriation, because it's not really coming from like a real source in a sense, it's an imagined source. But what that allows is for a white woman to take on a sexuality that is associated with an othered woman. So it's not associated with her racial identity. And it's just a garment. So then she takes it off again. So it's not associated with her body, right? It doesn't mark her as sexual. So she's able to maintain that kind of purity that, you know, because, you know, in the West, sexuality is really like historically been very bifurcated, right? It's virgin or whore. There's like nothing in the middle. And there's all sorts of examples of ways that othered women and their garments in particular are used by white women in order to take on a kind of sexuality that they can then take off. Whereas, you know, the women who are othered are always marked by that stereotypical representation, that racist representation. Yeah, Christine. So it's privilege once again. Absolutely. It's the privilege of white women. And so, you know, like, I don't know if we would find lots of images of women of color wearing harem trousers, for instance. I think we might find a few, certainly later on. I think I had one of a a African-American model in the 80s wearing Ungaro, but you know, not as many as the white women, certainly. Yes, Shane, the freedom of pockets. Pockets is a whole other feminist story. Actually, I think Cassidy Zachary is here from the podcast Dressed, and they just did an episode on the pocket, the undergarment, the pocket that was historically worn. So if you want to know more about that, you should check out that episode because I haven't listened to it yet, but I'm sure it'll be a great one.
So we have I had a question DM'd to me.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any difference with regard to blue jeans? I remember my mom telling me in the 1960s when she switched schools and wore them, and she was looked down on as backwards, and they were more associated with someone who couldn't afford nicer clothing. Funny how jeans cost more than slacks. That's the sentiment and the question.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that's interesting that Tanisha Ford writes about in her book, and I think she's talking about Stokely Carmichael. I could not think of his name. And his use of blue jeans and overalls as a way of connecting with working class, like the sharecroppers that he was talking to in the South and his activism. And at the time he was involved with Miriam Makeba. They were romantic partners, the great South African singer. And Makeba, who grew up very poor in South Africa, said, you know, that Carmichael didn't get it, and that people who were poor didn't want to wear those clothes. So you were sort of insulting them by wearing those clothes. They loved wearing beautiful, nice clothes and would change into those clothes. And so I think there are some really interesting sort of class dynamics that are at work here too, in terms of, you know, what's acceptable where. And I think even like, you know, with jeans, like, I don't even know where this comes from, but like for me, my perception is like, I don't usually, like, it took me a long time to wear jeans to work because I didn't think about them. I mean, I work in a place that has a pretty it doesn't really have a dress code. You know, everybody sort of wears as they choose, but, you know, they didn't feel to me to be professional attire. But it also, I think, can be situational too, you know, where are those kinds of clothes acceptable and where are they not? And I would think too, with something like jeans, in the US, like the region would also probably change, you know, how they were perceived. You know, so if you're in the Midwest, it's probably a bit different than if you're in the West Coast versus if you're on the East Coast. You know, different places I think have a different sense of formality and different signifiers for that formality too. I don't know if I answered that question. I hope so.
I think so. And so we're running out a little bit of time, and I just want to take this moment to thank you again, Dr. Pass, for sharing your scholarship, for sharing your knowledge and your musings through this still clearly relevant topic, as even if it's in somewhat of a lesser view, as you started out with Vice President Kamala Harris on the cover of Vogue wearing her trousers. So thank you all for joining us. I'm going to drop in the chat right now the direct link to where this will be posted. This lecture recording will be posted and Q&A session. That'll be done next week when I get a little bit of time to trim off the awkward beginnings of me just sitting in this room alone. And it'll be available, and I'll email all of the attendees today when that's posted so you can all access it and share it widely. And on that page, if you go to it directly, I just really want to last time plug the students' research work. It was the reason to gather this grant programming. They worked super hard, and while the pandemic disrupted a lot of things, those students prevailed in putting together some really interesting and visually rich projects. So if you can take a moment and you go to the Apple Treehouse, you'll see the link to the exhibition for the student online 3rd annual virtual history fair. So thank you all, and we will see you in the recording realm. Keep in touch with our Eventbrite to know, to keep in touch with the things that we're going to be doing in the upcoming weeks, months, and years with all of the Jersey City Office of Cultural Affairs programming. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.